I think Glasner have made his mind up fairly early on what he was going to do, and he was set in that decision. Excuse me. I think going to Nottingham Forest was perhaps, I'm sure the salary, the very high salary that he's, we've reported on the Athletic that he's expected to be earning around, I think, £13 million a year. I think is what it is. I'm sure that helps. I don't think that that's the only reason. Don't get me wrong. I think, like you say, I think Nottingham Forest have a bigger budget than Palace do. I think they're sort of a club that has a lot of infrastructure as well, and obviously great history. So I think those things would have appealed to Glasner as well. But he did make it clear that there needed to be improvement at Palace in every single area. If he was to stay, although he had, we later then found out that he had made his decision by that point. So I do think there's a mixture of things that are in there, but certainly, Forest have more money in theory to spend. Obviously, having sold Elliot Anderson, they got a lot more money than Palace do in that sense. Palace haven't made a major sale yet, although Maxence Lacroix is expected to join Chelsea for around £52 million. So I think Glasner's very ambitious. He wants to push things, and I think he felt that at Palace he wasn't able to do that. He wasn't able to push the club any further than he had, and he made great success. But I think he felt he was always pushing against the tide, and perhaps at Forest he feels that that's not something that will happen, and he feels more aligned with their vision of the way.
The surprise amongst Crystal Palace supporters and journalists that cover him that there hasn't been, dare I say, much vaunted interest in adamwarton this summer, or have Crystal Palace made clear from the stand straight off that he's not for sale no matter the offer?
I think Wharton is definitely for sale at the right price, as anyone is, I suppose. But I think if Palace were to get sort of an £80 million offer, then they would sort of have to accept that. Really, I think that's the sort of ballpark figure, I guess. Although that said, again, like Elliot Anderson, is kind of the benchmark. I think for Wharton, I don't think that they can get the same amount of money as Forest did for Elliot Anderson, but I think you're talking in that kind of range of 80 to 100 million. But I don't think I think because of Wharton's sort of Wharton's probably I think last season was his big, his most played season so far in the Premier League. But I think there's just some things about his game that maybe need to improve before, such as scoring goals, of course, and his physicality that need to improve before, he's going to get that kind of offer. And I think this season we're likely to see that improve. I think this will be a season where, I think Palace will hope that he then develops even further and then attracts those kinds of 80 to 100 million pound offers next summer, like Anderson did. And then Palace would gladly cash in on him because that is their model. They wouldn't want to lose him in some ways, of course. Like he's a fantastic player, he's a key part of their team. But I think they're expecting probably to lose him next summer rather than this summer. And to raise quite a significant amount of money. And they'll hope that he has a fantastic season, both in terms of pushing Palace forward, but also in terms of increasing his value.
At clubs like that, in terms of where Crystal Palace are going to be looking around this summer until he familiarises himself and adapts with players in terms of the Premier League. So I assume Crystal Palace intentions, like under Glasner, they looked at England, they looked at League One, they looked at Championship, looked at Germany. I imagine the much of the focus for Palace supporters and fans and journalists will be on that French market this summer.
Yeah, to be honest, I think like the manager won't be hugely involved, especially this summer, given that he's just coming in. I'm sure he'll have some views and opinions on who he would recommend, but Palace's sort of way of working is that sporting director model. The chairman, obviously, Steve Parish has his say in that as well. So I think it's more about the players that they need and they've targeted and they know and they think can make a difference within the budget that they've got, which is kind of not huge after the money they spent in January signing Brennan Johnson for around 35 million and Jurgen Strand Larsen for I think 43 million up front. So they spent a lot of money in January, which inhibits them this summer. They've obviously already signed Oscar Mingueza as a cover at right back on a free transfer. They've got Takahiro Tomiyasu, the former Arsenal defender, on trial at the moment with centre back or right back as cover. But I think they'll just look at various different markets and try and find the best value they can. I don't think it'll be sort of looking at what Pierre Sarge's knowledge of. I'm sure they'll look at his knowledge and take great knowledge from him, but I don't think they'll just target League On because the managers come from there. I think
I
they'll.
suppose, Matt, I know from being at a few Crystal Palace games in Europa Conference League as well, when I looked at the bench last year, it was a bit sort of stretched. There was a good awful lot of youngsters, and certain times Glasner played what he had on the field, dare I say. He was a bit hesitant to go to that bench quite often as well. So, in terms of Crystal Palace this year being in the Europa League as well, that's going to be an extra step up from the Conference League in terms of quality of opposition. They're going to have the same fixture schedule, the same fixture headaches as what they had last year. Is this Palace say it's great that we are in the Europa League, but is the depth of the squad there for, and does it put real jeopardy in terms of the Premier League, in terms of the demands that's going to put on? Obviously, if Crystal Palace go further, now that's not to say that will be the case. But if they go deep into the Europa League, is that going to put real questions and maybe put the whole Premier League project in jeopardy?
Certainly going to cause them a bit of stress. We saw last season, like you say, that their depth wasn't there, their strength in depth wasn't there. They lost, their form really fell off a cliff. In the second half of the season, I think it was 11 games or something without a win. It was a real struggle. And you look at the summer signings, they've only signed Oscar Mingueza. Yes, they have got Eddie Nketiah back from injury and Cheikh Doucouré back from injury. There are loanees returning, Romain Essa, Mateus França, but they haven't really proved themselves. So there's a lot of question marks over the strength of depth. And again, in pre-season, you can't read too much into it, but those players haven't really. Mateus França did score a hat-trick against Swindon, but it's obviously a League Two side. No disrespect to Swindon, it doesn't really tell you much about his future in the Premier League. They're certainly in a position where they could do with signing some more players who will provide depth. That's again what Oscar Mingueza is there for. They've obviously let Nathaniel Klein go at the end of his contract. So yeah, there's a lot to work on, and I think it could affect them this season in the Europa League and or in the Premier League, especially with two further games because there'll be eight league phase games in the Europa League versus six in the Conference League. Although Palace did play a playoff game, so in the Conference League last season. So yeah, it's going to be tough for Palace, I think, at times this season. They'll just have to hope that injuries don't hit as hard as they did last time.
Yeah, and I suppose as a new manager, obviously reaching the 40 points in the Premier League is the key objective for Crystal Palace. It as always has been for clubs like Crystal Palace, Fulham, Bournemouth, Brighton. That's the target straight off the bat. Reach that 40-point mark and then build from there. And I suppose with Pierre Sage going in, a new club getting used to the Premier League, I expect very early on the emphasis will be on the Premier League. So in some ways, could the Europa League, even though Palace fans are delighted at it, could it be group stages? Could it be looked as second in terms of importance for Pierre Sage, or will you treat them as equally as equals?
I think he'll definitely treat them as equals. He's coached in Europe before, so he has an idea of what that's like. And I think Palace will expect him to treat them as equal. But if, of course, Palace were to become embroiled in a relegation battle, for example, and they were still in the Europa League, then I think the main priority is avoiding relegation because it would be catastrophic for the club to be relegated, and that's always their first aim, like you say, reaching 40 points, securing Premier League safety. However, we saw last season with the Conference League what that meant to them, and the financial rewards and the stature of the club, and just the feel-good factor at the club as well. So I think Pierre Sarge will be under instruction to take everything as seriously as one another. However, if for any reason Palace are in a relegation battle and concerned about that, then they will probably switch to prioritising the Premier League to some extent. But they wouldn't sort of completely overlook the Europa League if that were to be the case. And I'm sure they'll be hoping that actually they can compete on both levels.
We know this year Unlike so many different years, there is so many new Premier League managers. I was looking at yesterday. I think it's nearly up on double figures that we have nearly 10 new managers starting at Premier League clubs this year. All of them hope to be successful. All of them hope to be, dare I say, come Christmas time, be in a good position. The reality is for all the clubs that change the managers gambles that some of them won't pay off. And I suppose we've seen last year with Forest, they they got trigger happy. Dare I say they pulled the trigger four times. In terms of Crystal Palace, obviously they were nice and settled under Oliver Glasner. Is Steve Parish, if things are not going well come October under Pierre Sage, are they going to be very patient with him? Are they going to look and maybe reevaluate and see where they are come February time? And if things obviously picked up, then obviously happy days. But if not, then make a decision. Or are Crystal Palace, given their status as a Premier League, and you mentioned it'd be catastrophic for them, can they even wait till February before making a decision?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Obviously, Palace will be hoping that Pierre Sarge hits the ground running and starts really well. They did pay compensation to Lons for him, which isn't something that Palace tend to do for managers. I think the only time they've done that under Steve Parish in the last 16 years is for Alan Pardew from Newcastle. I think that was sort of 10 years ago. So, it's a very unusual thing for Palace to do, and I'm sure that'll come into it. They won't want to have spent that money and then sort of effectively waste it. So I think they'll try and give PSR as much time as they can. And obviously the squad again, I think there'll be an understanding of what the squad is like and how big it is and what they can offer him. And I think they'll try and give him as long as they can. And hopefully I'm sure they won't be thinking about that. I'm sure they'll be thinking, how successful can we be? How well can we be doing in the Premier League? Can we kind of break into that top 10 or qualify for Europe through the league next season, as well as sustain a Europa League run? So they won't be thinking about any potential departure of Pierre Sarge. I'm sure in future they'll hope that actually he ends up getting poached by a bigger club because then it would show that he's been successful. But you do have to understand the reality that managers do fail. They were quite patient in the end with Oliver Glasner.